Hello there! This is the fourth of a four-part video series reviewing the Ruertu Eink note-taking device. And it's been a long time coming. We're going to finally conclude with my final thoughts about this device. We're going to actually start off with a comparison between the performance of this device versus a benchmark, which will be the Book Note Air 3C. Then we'll actually go into the pros and cons of the device. We'll talk about the use case, who is the device for ultimately in context of all that. And then, I'll give some of my ideas about where I think this device can go forward to kind of make it a little bit more competitive against devices like the Note Air 3C. And then we'll kind of close from there. Now, as I've done with all the other videos, I do want to have a full disclosure around the fact that this device was provided to me by the manufacturer for free. So I was given the device and I won't be giving it back. That's a thing, but I think as you'll find out, and it'll be clear in this evaluation, that did not paint how I'm reviewing the device. I'm treating this like any other device that I would have purchased for myself and reviewed. So I think the integrity of this video is intact, and I think you'll agree. But if you have any questions or comments about that, certainly feel free and I can respond to those. All right, without that, we've come a long way to get to this video. Why don't we get right into it? Okay, we're going to do some benchmarking around performance of the Ruertu device, which is right here on the right. And we're going to compare it to our benchmark, which is the Book's Note Air 3C here on the left. So let's just go ahead and start off with Google News. I'm going to go ahead and tap these about the same time. Okay, and let's just go ahead and check our settings in terms of the e-ink center. So here we're on balanced, that's fine. Over here we are on normal, that's great too. Okay, let's go ahead and see how well they scroll. Both pretty snappy. Let's go ahead and click on each article, see how quickly we get in there. A little bit quicker over here on the Note Air 3C. I should also point out that I have front lighting on both devices in order to kind of get an even level of light on each. The lighting does look different. This one's full cold lighting. This one's a combination of cold lighting and a little bit of warm lighting. Okay, so you have a sense of the performance of the application. Let's go ahead and get out of this on each device. And let's look at reading. We're going to go into Kobo books. Again, a little bit quicker of a loading over here in the 3C. We're going to go into this book Forever War. And we end up in the same spot. Let's go ahead and see how well this does page turns. Let's get out of, oops. Okay, here we go. Definitely quicker on the 3C. Let's check those settings just to make sure. We've got those. Here we have balanced. And here we have fast. Very good. Okay, so a little bit quicker over here, but still quite good on both devices. Just a step behind for the Ruertu. Very good. Let's go ahead and take a look at comics. Oops. We're going to go into the Kindle for that. Okay. And let's go ahead and advance. Actually, before we do that, let's go into Regal mode. Here we go. Regal mode is supposed to be particularly good for comics. Okay. All right, let's tap the screen. Not sure if I'm on sell by sell or not, so we'll take a look at that. No. Okay, here we go. So once again, we find the Ruertu just a step or two behind the 3C. So snappy, but not quite as snappy as the Books device. However, I am getting a cleaner image, so you can see some ghosting right around here. For example, take a look at the side of that. You can see some ghosting there, and here there's no ghosting. I'll go ahead and refresh the page just to illustrate that. See, all that ghosting went away. If I refresh this page, it's pretty much the same. Okay, let's go a couple more cells. Well, this time, actually, it was the Ruertu that was quicker. Not that time. Okay, pretty consistent performance with the 3C, a step ahead. All right, let's move on now to looking at a document, and we're going to go into storage on each device. Go into documents. And we're going to look at this annual report. Let's go ahead and launch that. Launch a little bit quicker for the Ruertu. We're just going to do some page turns, see how well that handles on each device. And a little bit quicker on the Ruertu this time. Okay, but again, both quite snappy. All right, let's do one last thing. We're just going to look at a writing latency for the notes. And this isn't meant to be a test per se. Just going to get a sense of the latency by writing on each device. We'll start with the 3C. Okay, we'll just bring the same stylus over on the Ruertu. Both you feel very much connected as you're writing. There might be a difference between the two, but as I'm writing, I certainly can't tell. Okay, that's the end of the demonstrations of just the general operational performance between the two devices. Okay, let's start talking about the pros and cons of the device. And before I get into that, I just want to make sure that this concept is pretty clear. I bucket my pros and cons in primary and secondary. And the difference is primary pros and cons are real things that you really want to think about in making a purchasing decision. They're the most important aspects of the device, good and bad, and that you should reflect on. The secondary pros and cons are things that really stood out for me. They're in a good or a bad way. They're not necessarily things that you would make a buying decision on. Maybe in totality, those might factor in, but they're things that aren't as important as the primary. So I like to split it out so that certain observations don't get more weight than they're due. And that's the process I do in order to do that. So having said all that, let's go ahead and check this out. Okay, so let's start with our primary pros of this device, and on top of the list is the solid design. There's no creaks in this. It has kind of a premium look and feel. It's a very nice looking device, and it's one of the strong points of this item. The UI performance is also very snappy and very responsive, and I think you could see that in a lot of the videos that preceded this one. You can just get from one place to the other fairly quickly. Not a lot of lag, if any at all. Just really nice to interact with the device. There is extra RAM and extra storage space on this device, so you get 6 gigabytes of RAM, you have 128 gigabytes of storage for documents or applications, and those are all kind of on the high end of E-Ink devices, so that's definitely a positive here. Of course, it comes with a Kaleido 3 color. Some people will think that Kaleido 3 is actually a negative. I actually feel it's positive. Definite limitations to Kaleido 3 color. Only 4,000, I believe, colors are available. So there's a lot of work in the software to kind of compensate for that. The pixel density is only at 150, but I still contend that Kaleido color is really nice, and I prefer that to black and white, and this device has that. Of course, access to the Google Play Store and logging in was very easy, and downloading apps very easy on this device. And in fact, the app performance is great across the board. I didn't have any unusual issues with the applications I downloaded. Of course, I downloaded standard things like Kindle and Kobo and Google News and Word and that sort of thing. But they all worked great, and there were no issues with that at all. So this is basically the summary of all the major strengths of this device. So now let's turn our attention to kind of the major cons of the device, significant reasons that might give you pause whether you wanted to purchase this or not. And we'll start off with the fact that it is expensive. It's at $600 currently on Amazon, and that is on the higher end for a 10-inch screen. It's not the highest, and we'll actually talk about that later in this video. But it is on the higher end, and when you have devices like the Note Air 3C that also has Kaleido color, which is at $500, or the Note Air 3, which is black and white, but at $400, that's definitely a consideration to keep in mind. I will remind you, however, that there is a cover that comes with the device that has a roughly $50 value, which helps, but it still is expensive, even if you consider that. Lots of bugs and rough edges, and let me kind of pause here. I made a list as I went through the review process, and I noted some of the more notable bugs and issues, and I'll just read off this list. In the note-taking app, I would write text in the note and then erase it, and I would write something else on top of that, and then I would use the lasso then to move that item, and when I did the lasso, some of the things I'd previously erased reappeared. Not all, but some. It was very strange. I showed in the very first video how the light indicators are misaligned. It's a very small thing, but you'd expect them, they both go from 0 to 36, and you'd expect them to be perfectly aligned, and they aren't. There was a time where I pasted an image in the note-taking app, and I went to drag it, and the image would just disappear. That actually happened a couple times. If you go into the reader function and you're in a PDF document, the pen tray says you can have a highlighter app, but it won't actually work in that document. There are times when you click on the little button, there's a little button called Speed Up, which is supposed to release some RAM that would, if your device is bogging down, then maybe that will help with performance. It's a button I generally don't use, but in playing with it, there were times I would press the button and then an app I had opened previously would just suddenly open up, and there was no reason why that should have been the case. We'll talk a little bit in depth in the next list of secondary cons, but the search functionality is very odd, and it's not clear what it's supposed to be searching on or any consistency in those results. I found the clock was out of sync when it was taken off of Wi-Fi, so that was an issue that I had noticed. And finally on this list, there was a time when I was doing some writing in the notebook and I added a page, and the page added, but then the writing came over too in kind of a degraded kind of form, and it shouldn't have come over at all. And it was fixed with an easy refresh of the screen, but it was a very odd bug. The common theme to a lot of these is most of these bugs are just little annoyances. The system never crashed, so it was very stable. There were a couple times where apps crashed, however, sometimes as a result of these bugs. But it's just not a premium experience. You have a premium hardware device and you're constantly running into these things. Most of my sessions I would run into some sort of glitch like this, and it's something that really needs to be addressed that you don't have when you have competitor devices. So it's definitely a con to consider. Anyway, so then the battery life is kind of the next big issue, and the battery life is really poor. It's not so bad that it's an unusable device, and I wouldn't say that it's a terrible battery life, but it is definitely on the weaker side. And if you want to see the details of that, I put that all in the previous video where I go into detail about the different aspects of battery drain with the device. But it's definitely notable. And it's a con for the device. The Notes application is okay. It doesn't have a lot of features, and I'm going to go ahead and put on a graphic on the screen, and this kind of shows the level of complexity between competitors and their note-taking apps. And you see that this device kind of falls among the most simpler of the note-taking devices, like a Scribe and the Kobo Ellipsa 2E. And those devices have good writing experiences. This isn't a bad thing, except that this device falls behind a lot of competitors like books, like Supernote and even MobiScribe, and that they don't have nearly the feature set that those devices have. Being on the most complicated isn't always the best. I actually think that Supernote has the best note-taking app on this list, but regardless of which one you feel is the best, there's a pretty notable gap, and I think that needs to be called out as a primary con. There is ghosting, and this is not unusual for this device. This is inherent to Kaleido 3. In fact, I would make an argument that it's pretty impressive what the Ruertu or Bigme devices do. And I actually did a video called something to the effect of 2 ways to mitigate ghosting, which I had released at the end of November. And that's where I contrast the book's Note Air 3C, which has a dedicated graphical processing unit, versus, in that case, the Bigme InkNote Color Plus, which only uses software to address it. And the results were impressive. The Bigme really held its own in that exchange. And actually, if you look at the previous video in this series, and you look at the comics comparison between the Note Air 3C and this Ruertu device, I think the Ruertu did really well actually in that exchange. So it handles ghosting well, but I'm putting it on this list because this is something very inherent in Kaleido 3. So if I'm going to call out Kaleido 3 as a positive, I have to call out ghosting in particular as a negative, and that's why I'm including it here. So it handles it well for a device that has a Kaleido 3 screen, but nevertheless, it's something someone needs to consider if they're thinking of purchasing any device that has Kaleido 3, including this one. So that then takes us to the secondary pros and cons, and we're starting with the pros. And these are things that I like a lot about the device, but I wouldn't necessarily say they're game changers in terms of driving a purchasing decision, but they're worth calling out. So we'll start off with the camera and document scanner. Just the fact that this has a camera that you can take pictures of documents and then of course use a software to write on them is a positive thing. It's not a huge selling point, but it's a good selling point, and so I'm going to include that here. The home screen is customizable. We saw that there were 2 different general layouts. I prefer the app style, but there's also more of an office style, which is very similar to the Note Air 3C. The difference being the customization on this device in that style is way more than it is for the Note Air 3C. You can decide what you want on the spine, you can decide the order, even how far apart spaced the icons are. So just a lot more flexibility in terms of giving that device the fundamental look that you want. So I think it deserves credit for that. The highlighter in the Notes app, may seem like a small thing, but I remember with the Big Me Ink Note Plus, I would make a to-do list, for the weekend. And as, things got checked off, taking the highlighter and just, marking it off was a really pleasant experience. And yes, I understand. You can draw a line through it. You can check mark it. There's a lot of ways to replace that type of functionality. But the highlighter is just done so well, in my opinion, and especially relative to other devices, that I really appreciate it, and I think it's worth calling out. The front lighting is generally really good. Colors are a little bit different in temperature than you see with the Boox Note Air 3C, for example, but perfectly acceptable. And I don't, other than one bar on the very left side, which the Note Air 3C also suffered from, it's kind of a little different shading when you use front lighting. It was very consistent across the screen, and I think it's a pro. The cover that the device comes with isn't a functional cover in that you can fold it up and turn it into a stand, but it is a nice cover, and I think it really does add to the premium look of the device. The hardware and look of the device are really well done, and the cover complements that. There's only one issue with the cover, but we'll cover that when we get, no pun intended, when we get to the secondary cons. Global handwriting. So the downer of this is it took me so long to figure out how to take advantage of this functionality in a few of its modes. But now that I've learned it, and I showed that in detail in the last video, this is really impressive. And the only reason actually that I've listed it as a secondary pro as opposed to primary is I'm just not sure how much actual use someone would get in doing that functionality, but it's definitely well done. I really appreciate it now that I understand it fully. At least I think I understand it fully. And it's certainly a secondary pro, and maybe for some it is a primary pro, but I do think it probably deserves to be listed here. The split screen function is really good. I really like the functionality of it. Is it the best split screen I've ever seen? No, I wouldn't go quite that far, but I think it's close, and I think it's more than acceptable. I was pretty impressed with how that worked. And those are the secondary pros. Let's head over to the cons. Actually, I just almost forgot. Just before we get to the cons, there are a few things that could have been secondary pros, and I chose not to add them to this list. And I want to kind of talk about that really quickly. First off is the ChatGPT app, which I demoed in the previous video. That would be a secondary pro if it weren't for the fact that other devices like Boox can go into the Google Play Store and download the ChatGPT app from OpenAI. Now, I haven't done a comparison between the two applications. My only point here is that it's nice to have the ChatGPT app on this Ruertu device, but that could be matched easily by any device with the Google Play Store. So I just chose not to list it as a pro, but I do like its inclusion, and I think it's a nice add. The other thing, in a kind of similar vein, I suppose, is around the meeting records application. And I guess that's a little different in that I just don't know how well that app works. I haven't tested as fully as the other functions on the device, so it seems like a positive to me, but I haven't had a chance to really see how well you can calibrate it, and therefore how accurate the transcripts are and what have you. So I was impressed by the demo that I saw, which I ran through in the last video, but not quite to the point that I wanted to add that to the list. But I did want to at least give kind of an honorable mention, if you will. I guess it would be a tertiary pro. But anyway, let's now go ahead and head over to the cons. Scroll through this real quickly. Okay. The device can sometimes run warm. And this is really more so if you set it into the performance mode, which is in the battery saving settings. I really didn't notice it run that warm with power saving on. And almost all, and virtually everything that I've demonstrated in these video series has been with power saving mode on. But just be aware that if you do turn performance mode on, instead, you are, in addition to that battery drain, you're going to have the device warm up a little bit. It wasn't so bad that I saw it affect performance, nor was it so bad that you couldn't hold it, but it is a little disconcerting when the device runs warm, and it did in that mode, and I just want to call that out. I mentioned earlier about the clock getting out of sync, so just kind of repeating that here. But that's only if you don't have Wi-Fi on. I didn't notice that if Wi-Fi was established, but I did think it was worth mentioning. The G sensor sometimes could be difficult, and I have to admit, I just did a review of the Kobo Ellipsa 2E, and the G sensor on that is amazing. It is perfect. And so, I was contrasting, in a sense, my experience here versus that, and that's a little bit unfair. But I did find that the G sensor kind of stuck in a couple times, and I think I caught one of those on film. So it is, I think, appropriate to call this out as a secondary con. It worked generally, but every once in a while is a bit fidgety. There is a learning curve to this device, and I guess that's exemplified by, the global handwriting app that I talked about, where I've had Bigme devices since March, but I've never fully understood that until now. And what is it, 9 months or more later. But the device in general also has a learning curve beyond that particular application. It is a somewhat complicated device, no different than books in many respects, but that is a negative I would hold for books as well. And so I do think that's a con. It's a barrier to people that maybe don't want to invest the time in kind of learning how to work with the device, and it's worth calling out. This is a weird one. So I'm noting no notifications, and I actually would rather my devices don't have notifications. So why list this as a secondary con? Well, there's other devices that allow for notifications but have a button that then essentially means you don't get them. And to me, that's the better solution. So while I don't want notifications and I'm not interested, and it doesn't really bother me this device doesn't have them, it would have been better if the device at least allowed for it, because maybe you're different and maybe you do want notifications and you want to turn those on. This doesn't give you that option. There are no notifications. And I thought that could have been done a little bit better. The OCR is not good with handwriting, and my handwriting is not the best. I will absolutely admit that. But even when I did pretty clear print, it wasn't always translating that very well. I found the OCR was better when you're scanning text. That seemed to be a much more successful endeavor. But handwriting was much more miss than hit, and I don't think it's very good. I just listed it as a secondary con because, that's not, a major element of the device, so that's why it's here. The search functionality, which I also alluded to in the primary cons, I'm not even sure what it's supposed to be searching for. There was one time that I was able to search a document and get a return on that search, but there were times where I searched a document and got nothing. Nothing, either handwriting or print. So I don't know what it's measuring, and it doesn't seem to be working consistently. Honestly, based on my experience, I would have rather they had no search functionality at all other than what's in the device. Why is it a minor con? I don't generally use search functionality. Sometimes in notes, in handwriting. That's an area that books and Supernote do really well. But outside of that, I don't tend to use that function. So I did list this as a minor con as a result of that. The Reader app isn't as sophisticated as the Books app, so you've got more features on the Books app. It's still generally pretty good, though, and so to me, it wasn't a primary con. Now, if you were someone buying a device like this and your focus was on annotations and all sorts of, loading all sorts of different documents onto the device, then maybe you might elevate this to a primary con. I just thought it was something that was still pretty good, still pretty powerful, just a step behind the competition. Unlike the Notes app, which I think is more significantly behind. So I felt this was more of a secondary than a primary con. Speakers are a bit tinny, and we heard this in the previous video when we watched the YouTube video. They're fine, they're okay, but they're not great. The last thing I want to talk about is, and this goes back to the case, and I alluded to one issue with the case. There's a loop on the case that's just big enough to hold the stylus the device comes with. And the reason why I'm calling that out is the stylus that it comes with isn't particularly special. It's fine functionally, it has a button and an eraser, and those all worked great. And the button, by the way, is only an area eraser, so it's not programmable. I was wondering that in the first video. I just want to confirm that here. It's not programmable, but it's fine for what it is. And it writes fine. I just don't like it because it's a thinner shaft, and I find that my hand, kind of is not as comfortable to grip over time. And I prefer thicker styli, so I would have preferred it be thicker. But if I did have a thicker stylus, like say one of the styluses that come for books, or if I went with something like the Wacom 1 or anything like that, it wouldn't fit in the loop because the loop is too small. So I think that was a miss. I think the styluses could have been better, and then the loop could have been better. Just to put that into context, MobiScribe has a cover where it has a very tight loop because they have a very thin stylus as well. But then surrounding that loop is this magnetic loop, if you will. It's actually two flaps that kind of connect magnetically. And so you can actually put a thicker stylus in that case, and it holds it fairly well. So that would have been something I would have recommended in this particular case, because as it is now, there's no magnetic connection for a stylus on this device. And so if you want to use a stylus that's thicker, you're basically going to have to just carry two things because it won't attach or carry in the loop of this cover. So that's my negative here. It's definitely a usable stylus, but could have been better. It's one of the weaker points of the hardware, which otherwise is quite excellent. So that is the summary of all the major pros and cons and minor pros and cons regarding this device. Okay, so now that we've gone over all the pros and cons of the device, let's kind of talk about the use case. I mean, who is this device for? Well, if we're talking about someone who's interested and was looking at the Books Note Air 3C, I don't think the Ruertu device competes very well against that. Now, there are a number of things, almost half the list actually, of the secondary pros of this Ruertu device I would argue are better aspects than books. I'm thinking of things like the global handwriting functionality. I'm thinking of the highlighter, and there's a few others on that list. But those are secondary pros. And in the more important categories, it's pretty clear the Note Air 3C is a superior device, and I don't really have a case to make for this device over the 3C. But take a look at this grid. This is showing the specifications of the Note Air 3C on one side, the Ruertu device in the middle, and the Tab Ultra C Pro at the end. So here's my thought process. So imagine you're someone that's thinking about the Tab Ultra C Pro. For whatever reason, you need that 6 gigabytes of RAM, and maybe it's because of how you intend to use the device. You're doing a lot of kind of home office stuff. And that's really important. So the Note Air 3C is not in the picture. You were looking at the Tab Ultra C Pro with the keyboard cover, but since that's $800 combined, that's too expensive. So you were actually thinking of more of a Bluetooth keyboard. You can actually even get a better Bluetooth keyboard for cheaper that way. And maybe you get the cover, and then you get a stand. And so I don't know what the keyboard or stand would cost. That's a separate thing. But the device plus the cover is going to cost $700. Yes, you could get the cover for free if you go through Books, but you're not sure. You may be returning the device, and in that case, you really want to order from a shop like Amazon. So you're looking at this Tab Ultra C Pro, and you're looking at $700. The Ruertu is selling for $600, and so both include a cover. There's a $100 difference between the two devices. That's an intriguing option. Yes, the Tab Ultra C Pro is the better device. Now, I haven't reviewed that particular device, but I do have the Tab Ultra C. and I have seen the reviews that other people have done who I trust. And so I think I do have a pretty good sense of the performance of the Ultra C Pro. And it's well regarded. I mean, I don't think there's a question that that device is better than the Ruertu device. I think that it is. The question is it $100 better? And I think that's the use case that's intriguing. And by the way, I'm not sure I know the answer to that question. The Ruertu is going to be able to do pretty much everything the Tab Ultra C Pro can do. Maybe it won't be as snappy. Your keyboard might have a quicker connection to the screen. Going between apps might be a little bit quicker on the device, but does that justify a $100 premium? The one thing that would give me pause, I think the strongest selling point for the Tab Ultra C Pro over the Ruertu device will be the battery life. That strikes me as the most meaningful of the specifications in terms of actual usage. But the Ruertu makes a case for itself in that particular use case. So that's who I think this device might be for. Someone that's looking to do a little more home office stuff where the 6 gigabytes of RAM comes into play, but you're looking to be a little more, relatively speaking, budget conscious about the device. Whether someone should get the Ruertu versus the Tab Ultra C Pro, I'm actually not going to state an opinion on that. I see the pros and cons. My only point is the Ruertu makes an argument for itself that's worth considering. I want to take a moment now to kind of offer my suggestions for the way forward for this Ruertu device, and this is true for Big Me as well. And there are 3 things that I think that should be focused on moving forward that I think would change the competitiveness of this particular product. So I'm going to start off by cleaning up those bugs, right? Those glitches. Now, again, they don't, cause the device to crash. They're easy to work around, but they're all things that really kind of belie the other work around the software that's really good. I mean, while the hardware has this very consistent, very premium sense, the software can have that too if it weren't for these glitches. And I think those are something that really, they're small things, but they make a big deal in terms of the impression that they leave on the user. So I really think a major focus on that is important. The second thing I would focus on is the note-taking app, improving the functionality of that. And this is what I've got a little bit of a twist on. I wouldn't look to Books to develop the app, that much further. I understand that Books has a lot more features than this particular device has in its note-taking app, but more features isn't necessarily better. In fact, if we look at, the levels of complexity, Books is the most complicated, but I think Supernote is better. So that's what I would actually advise. Look to Supernote. And again, you can't just bridge the gap, between this device and Supernote, but you can be strategic about it, and you can pick a couple key features to focus on. And that might be enough. This is not a bad note-taking app. It has the fundamental core. Add a few key features, like maybe something equivalent to the star marking system, maybe having a triangle instead, which would be more efficient, or maybe having the same functionality as the headers or what have you. Just a couple key features would really take this note-taking app to another level, and the device along with it. And the last thing I'd throw out there is just focus on making the battery life better. And there's a couple ways you can probably do that. I mean, obviously you can throw in a larger battery. I mean, that's one potential option, but really optimizing the software so that the battery lasts longer is probably the best bet in the long run, and that's what I would focus on. So if you focused on those 3 things for this device, I think this device would have a much more competitive place in the marketplace, even potentially with the Note Air 3C. So those are the things that I would recommend for Ruertu to focus on going forward. And if you can focus on those things and do firmware updates to improve those things on this device, then I think the options and the marketplace potential will just go from there. But that's just one person's opinion. All right, let's go ahead and close out this video review. I just want to say thank you to the people at Ruertu for providing this device. I really did enjoy this process, and I do have a lot of good things to say about the device. And will this become part of my normal rotation of devices? No, but I think it was definitely worth taking the time to explore, and I'm glad to have done this review series. And again, I'll keep it and keep looking for those firmware updates and update you guys in this channel if improvements come and how those fare. All right, if you have any questions or comments you want to add about this, just go ahead and put that into the comments. Otherwise, I will see you next time.